some good things this morning. And so Revelation chapter 8 verse 6. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in mid-air call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because the trumpet blasts about to be sounded by the other 3 angels." Well, as I said, hard words. What is going on here in this scene of the judgments of God? It's not quite how it might seem, and so stick with us this morning. You may have heard on the news recently, in the last 24 hours, that Iceland has been in the grip of an earthquake swarm. I'd never heard of an earthquake swarm. Some of us are terrified of swarms of bees or swarms of locusts. I can't imagine what it must be like to be in an earthquake swarm. I believe that earlier this month in Iceland they endured 3,000 earthquakes in one day. And that's all culminated in a volcanic eruption near the city of Reykjavik in the past day or so. It's quite unusual for Iceland to have a volcanic eruption. That volcano hadn't erupted for the past 800 years, but now it's pouring forth lava there in Iceland. And you know, in some places, earthquakes and tremors are a daily occurrence, like Santiago in Chile, where they have many earthquakes a year. Couple a week. And that's a constant reminder, isn't it, that life on earth is not quite safe. Life on earth is not quite what it should be. I mean, what do you do in a major earthquake? Hold on to the door frames of your house or get under the table, but they're splitting and shattering. Or if you're outside, maybe grab a tree, an ancient tree that's been there for 100 years. You can't get your arms around its trunk. It's very, very strong and rooted, but even the trees are being uprooted in a major earthquake. Or you fall to the ground to hold on to it, but that too is being shaken and literally opening up underneath you. And you realize in a major earthquake that nothing can be depended on. The things that we take for granted, the terra firma even, maybe shouldn't be called terra firma after all, because it's not that firm. These things are not that safe. And in this part of the vision, John is seeing the world in the convulsions of suffering, seeing the world through the eyes of the judgments of God, the earthquakes of existence. Have you ever been in a situation where your world seems to be falling down, where the mountains you trust in seem to be collapsing, where the ground under your feet seems to be shaking? These are the pictures that John is giving. Again, we need to say early on as we look at this picture, this is not saying that mountains are going to melt or that there's going to be great earthquakes beyond that which we normally experience. It's saying that this is what it is to live in the world, to depend on the things of this world. In the end, they get shaken. And so the question of suffering comes upon us again, doesn't it? And we have here a perspective on suffering and the problems of life that come through the eyes of the judgments of God. Why do people suffer? Why do we have these great quakes in our existence? Maybe the loss of a loved one, or the loss of an income, feels like a great earthquake, a great volcanic eruption of danger and devastation in our lives. The first thing to notice, and we talked about this last week, and so we won't spend ages on it this morning, but the first thing to notice is that in all of these things, God is listening. In all of these things, God is listening. It's what we thought about last week, and when we go to back to verses 1 to 4, 1 to 5 of Revelation chapter 8, we have this wonderful picture, don't we, that at the centre of heaven, the priority of heaven, as we considered last week, is the prayer of God's people. And those prayers are precious in heaven, and they're powerful on earth. And these judgments are coming down in the context of the prayers of God's people. These angels who are sounding these trumpets, and these judgments that are coming forth as these trumpets are sounded, are coming forth as a result of the prayers of God's people that are heard in heaven. There is a link between what goes on planet Earth, what we pray on planet Earth, and on the global stage, and how God responds, and the earthquakes that happen in this world, whether they are geological phenomena or just the crises that come upon us in our lives. And so as the seven angels prepare to blow their trumpets, as John in his vision sees these calamities coming down on the earth, the vision is telling them that God is answering prayer. God is answering prayer. These events are not random. They seem chaotic and just totally destructive, but this vision is telling us actually that God's hand is upon them. In response to the prayers of God's people, the chaos and devastation that seems to run riot in this world is actually being held back and controlled. God is exercising sovereign control over the events of this world through the prayers of his people. And so what is he up to? Well, the next thing to notice is that God is limiting. God is limiting. The first way that God answers prayers in these things is by limiting the chaos. And we can read these verses and we can think, first of all, well, this is just totally chaotic. This is just horrible. But notice the limits that God is putting. Notice that in answer to the prayers of God's people, God is limiting what is happening on this earth. It's limiting the chaos and the suffering that we endure in this creation. We thought, I mentioned last week, the illustration of the man who throws the punch outside the pub, or the child that pushes his brother at the top of the stairs. And how once you've done that act, you can't control what happens to your brother as he slips down the stairs. You can't control whether he's going to take a catastrophic head injury as he hits the deck at the bottom. And that's what's happened with the human race, isn't it? That Satan came into this world and he whispered that devastating lie into the ears of Adam and Eve and encouraged them to eat that fruit, to disobey God. And Adam and Eve agreed, and the human race went into league with the enemy of life, went into league with the destroyer, and chaos came into the world. Destruction and death came into God's good creation. And we've called destruction into the world. We've already seen that in this picture, haven't we, with the living creatures calling forth the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And we know, don't we, that creation walks with a limp because of the rebellion of the human race. As Paul says in his letter to the Romans, that the creation is groaning in childbirth. Like a woman in labor, the creation is groaning with the pain of childbirth. And that's a reference to the suffering and the pain that is happening in the world at the moment. And when we say yes to those sinful impulses to punch that man outside the pub who's annoying me, or to push my brother who's stolen my toy, or whatever it might be, is to say those poisonous words to that friend of mine. When I say yes to those impulses, I'm giving evidence that I am like our first parents, Adam and Eve, that we too are in league with destruction and chaos. We think it's a friend. We think it's a weapon to yield, to get our own way. But the truth is, it invites destruction and chaos into our lives. But here we see this picture that God is a gracious and a limiting God. It's we who have called the destruction and the chaos, but God is limiting it. Notice with the first trumpet in verse 7, the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and the green grass was burned up. Notice that it's a third. Notice that it's not all. Do you recall that scene in the Garden of Eden? And God calls to them, and God calls them out and says, "What have you done?" And Adam blames his wife, and Eve blames the creation. And from that moment of turning on one another and turning on the creation that we live in, we have invited that devastation and that destruction into the world. We effectively declared war on the natural world around us, and we know more than any other generation, don't we, the results of the war that we have declared on the creation around us. Where would it end, the war that we've declared on the creation? Where would it end? Where would it end all the plastic in the ocean and the overfishing of the waters, the devastation of natural habitats? Nuclear waste being deposited into the sea. We are slowly, year by year, I don't know if you know this, but year by year, we are slowly, literally setting this world on fire. And we could go on, couldn't we, listing all the things that we are doing to the natural world. We've declared war on our environment. And where will that war end? In the end, that war, left unchecked, would end in total devastation of this creation. But here's the good news of this vision. God is limiting the effects of our behavior. Only a third will be devastated. Only a third of the creation will be impacted by this human activity in the end. And of course, we say it again, this is a symbolic third. And what it means is that this destruction that we're wreaking on this world is limited. We will not destroy this world. Isn't that good news? Isn't that good news when you hear on the news about another rainforest being removed and habitats being destroyed of thousands and thousands of species that we've not even discovered yet? We're killing them before we've discovered them as we destroy their habitats. And we think about the plastic waste in the ocean and all those kinds of things, the hole in the ozone. But the good news of this vision is that God is in the business of limiting the suffering and the chaos that we have invited in and that we continue to act out against the creation. Did you know this year that the hole in the ozone closed up? Why did the hole in the ozone close up this year? Well, the reason underneath all the reasons why the hole in the ozone closed up this year is found in this vision that God is limiting what happens to this world. He's limiting the end result of our bad behavior. And so we thank God, don't we, for efforts to clean up the oceans. We do not take our Bibles and say, this world is disposable, do what you want with it. That's a despicable thing to say. No, we plead with God for the creation. We plead with God for this world. We plead with God that this temple that he has made for us to meet with him might be restored and renewed. And we thank God when we hear about efforts to find renewable sources of energy and efforts to give clean drinking water to the entire population of the world. And underneath all of those efforts is this evidence that there is a good God limiting the destruction that we are wreaking on our planet. And that continues with the second and the third and the fourth trumpets. In verses 8 to 9, another trumpet, the second angel sounds his trumpet. Something like a huge mountain all ablaze is thrown into the sea. A third of the sea is turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. There it is again, destruction and devastation, but it's limited. Again, mountains are probably pictures of empires falling. And so the vision is saying that empires will fall, but God will limit the devastation that fall incurs. Ships are probably a picture of trade and wealth that we all depend on for our livelihoods. And when we lose our trade and when we lose our wealth and when we lose our income, the good news of this vision is God limits the devastation that might otherwise cause. This too is 1/3. The power of the sea to swallow up mountains is limited. Any town you go into in the United Kingdom, unless it's quite a new town, will have a river running through the middle of it. And every now and again that river might burst its banks and it might come thundering down the high street. It might take shops and houses and homes with it. And every now and again we're reminded of the power of those rivers that run through our towns and our cities. And we're reminded that actually if this river was to rise up above its banks, it could destroy this town in a matter of moments. Great wall of water, this great torrent of water that comes through every town and city that we live in. And very often we can look at that river and we can see it rising, and all we can think about is the fear and the destruction that it might cause. But then we also need to remember, don't we, that when it's gently making its way through the town and it's providing us with drinking water and leisure activities and a peaceful view, we remember that that's being limited by God, that it's being held back, that the power of the river is being used for our blessing and not for our destruction. And then we have the third trumpet in verses 10 to 11, the poisoning of the waters. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Wormwood is probably a very bitter and poisonous herb that was well known in those days. That's what we think it probably was. And again, it's letting us know that the waterways are not all the water in this world is drinkable. Not all the water in this world gives life like it should do. And again, we only need to turn on daytime television, don't we, to hear those appeals, those emotional appeals to help to provide drinking water in the third world, where hundreds and hundreds of children die every week from drinking poisonous water. It should never have been like that, and God is not willingly throwing down evil on this world. We invited it in. And we continue to invite it in by the way we build our own empires at the expense of others. It would be naive or just downright dishonest, wouldn't it, to have this picture in our minds of us innocently getting on with our lives when suddenly God in his wrath throws down some thunderbolt of suffering our way. No, that's dishonest, because the truth is we're part of this created order. We have been put in charge of it by the Creator. And when we turned against God, we turned against his creation too, and we waged war against it. But here's the good news of this vision. He is limiting the impact. He is the God who makes wars cease. Psalm 46, verse 9. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shield with fire. In our own world today, in our own existence today, our own experience today, we might be looking up to God and wondering, why are you allowing coronavirus to do all of this? But here is the truth. If it were left up to us, and if God were not limiting things and bringing wars to an end and limiting the suffering that we've allowed in, coronavirus would be laying waste to the human race and nothing will be able to stop it. So that we thank God for every scientific step forward, and every vaccination given, and every restriction removed, because every one of those things is an act of sheer grace that we do not deserve, from the hand of the God who limits the suffering that we have brought into his good creation. And so in all of these things, God is limiting, and he is limiting with a purpose, and that's the final thing that we noticed this morning, that God has a purpose in all of these sufferings. He's taking hold of the chaos, and he's taking hold of the total destruction. He's pulling it back, he's holding it back, and he's allowing it to come forward in a limited way for a purpose. And so we see finally that in all of these things, God is calling. God is calling. What are the angels doing around the throne? What are these 7 angels doing? They're blowing trumpets, aren't they? The first angel sounds his trumpet. The second angel sounds his trumpet. The third angel sounds his trumpet. And in the Old Testament, where Revelation gets most of its pictures from, the trumpet was the sound of that was that was sounded before the prophet spoke. And so before the prophet spoke, he or one of his assistants would take a shofar, would take a great big ram's horn, and he would blow into it. And that sound of the shofar being sounded was the sound for God's people to gather and to listen, because God was going to speak. And so we could say that these sufferings that come into the world, they have a message to give us. The sufferings of the world are limited by God, but they're also repurposed by God, turned, if you will, into prophets. Or at least the trumpets of the prophets. When the enemy whispered that lie into Adam and Eve's ear to disobey God and to eat the fruit and to turn against God and to turn against his creation, the enemy's plan and purpose was total devastation. The complete ruin of creation, but God is working a different purpose. And the purpose is to call people to repent. The enemy whispers devastation into this world, but God is shouting to us in our sufferings and into the suffering that we allowed in. He's calling to us like a trumpet blast. God is not to blame for the sufferings of this world. But when the enemy whispered those sufferings into the ear of Adam and Eve, and when we brought them into reality with our rebellion, God determined to use those very same sufferings and that very same pain to call us back to himself and to grow us in our dependence on him. To turn away from trusting in the perishing and failing things of this life and to cling to the only rock of certainty that we can have in this life, that there is a good God calling to us in all of this. That when your friends and your family let you down, when those you trust lie to you or mock you or whatever it might be, when you feel the pain of that, God is saying to you in that suffering, you can't trust those things. No, you can't trust those things. Don't cling on to those. They are not mountains that you can cling on to. One day they will fall into the sea and one day they will let you down, but you can depend on me. I'm calling you back to me. The judgment of God has a purpose. It's not total destruction. It's not devastation. That's the work of the enemy of the human race. But having said all of that, pain and suffering will always be a problem to us, won't it? We will always prefer not to have pain and suffering, and there will always be a part of us, I think, while we're this side of eternity, there will always be a part of us that says to God, stop it, why are you doing it? Pain and suffering will always be a problem to us, but I think in some ways that's part of the point. Because God is using it to call us back. And if he just whispered gently from the corner, we'd never listen, would we? In his wonderful book on the sufferings that we endure, C.S. Lewis says, in a book called The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis says, we can ignore pleasure, but pain insists on being attended to. When was the last time you had a toothache? Pain insists on being attended to, doesn't it? And C.S. Lewis says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a dead world. God uses the pains of this world and the suffering of this world that we invited in. He limits it and he orders it and he uses it to shout into our existence, come back to me. In the end, the judgments of God on this world are not to destroy the world, but to limit the destruction and to call people back to himself. And therefore it's redemptive, isn't it? The judgment of God is redemptive. God is restoring all things. God is using the suffering of this world to restore this world. God's judgment upon the creation is redemption, not destruction. To limit suffering, to reshape it into the shape of a trumpet that might blare into our hearts and our minds for our good and for his glory. God is bringing good out of this evil. He's bringing order out of your chaos. He's bringing beauty out of the ugliness of our own sin. And he's calling us to restoration through the chaos and the pain of this life. That's what this vision tells us. And we must never forget, must we, when we think about the judgments of God, that in the end, the judgment of God is that he himself would become subject to that final judgment. The judgment of God is in the end, is that he would become subject to the final judgment so that we need not, so that we might be able to answer his call to return to him. If we answered his call to return to him just by trying to live a good life or do religious things, we'd never manage it. And so we need some kind of radical salvation, don't we? And that's what we see in the cross of Jesus Christ. The judgment of God in the end is that he himself would become wounded instead of us. The judgment of God is that in the end, that God himself would feel the full force of our bloodlust and our declaration of war and animosity to everything that's good. In the end, the judgment of God is that he would bleed and die for us. The judgment in the end falls on him. The judgment in the end is that the Creator is cursed and his creation is redeemed. What a wonderful Saviour. It's a phrase that Shakespeare uses in the film, in the play Much Ado About Nothing. If you don't know the story of Much Ado About Nothing, there's a film with Kenneth Branagh in it, 1993 film with Kenneth Branagh in it. I recommend, this is your homework for today. Watch Much Ado About Nothing. And the phrase that Shakespeare uses is that the judgment is redemption. O villain, you will be condemned to everlasting redemption for this. So the judgment of God on this world is to be saved. The judgment of God on this creation is to be redeemed. And the very pain and the very suffering that we invited in, that the enemy meant for destruction, will be used for our good. And if you want a really good gospel story, then watch that film or read that play Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare and see how Claudio is condemned to redemption. We don't have time to share that story with you this morning that I was going to finish with, but you can watch it or you can read it this Sunday evening or some other time. Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare, and a wonderful gospel picture of how God is using, of how God uses judgment to bring redemption. And so be encouraged by this vision. And don't turn away from those parts of the Bible that look difficult and dangerous. Read carefully, watch carefully, listen carefully, think. Put it into the context of the big story and just see the wonderful grace of God on every single page. If you're suffering at the moment, be sure of this. God is limiting your suffering and he is repurposing it so that you might lose your faith in all of the things in this world that you might be trusting in, and that you might turn to him in faith. And we're going to sing